On the morning of March 5, 1989, the Hopewell Golf Course in New Jersey opened for business like any other day. As customers poured in and began their rounds, everything seemed like a typical Sunday for the course. Later that afternoon, though, two golfers made their way over to the 17th hole, where one of them had hooked a shot into a wooded area just off the green. As he walked to get the ball, he found it had landed near an old paint can. Curious as to what it was doing there, the golfer opened it and made a terrible discovery: the severed head of a young woman. Police arrived on scene and were immediately faced with hurdles in identifying their victim. No missing persons report matching her description had recently been filed, and the killer had gone through great lengths to make her unidentifiable. Just over a month later, a severed pair of legs was found to the north in Jefferson Township, which police theorized belonged to the Jane Doe found on the golf course. Blood testing done on the victim determined that she was suffering from HIV, and this, coupled with the fact no one had reported her missing, as well as other physical features present on her body, led police to conclude she was likely a prostitute. A model was made of her head and pictures of it released to the public in hopes that someone could come forward and help identify her. Tragically, though, no one did, and it would take 5 more years to find out what happened to their victim, and even longer to identify her remains. In the meantime, her killer would begin a ghastly spree across New York's underworld that was so heinous it would earn him the nickname the Ripper. On July 14, 1991, over 2 years after the events on Hopewell Golf Course, firefighters were conducting a training exercise near the Hudson River. Here they discovered the body of a young woman floating in the water. She was 31-year-old Barbara Jacobs, who had a long criminal record that included drug possession and prostitution. Her last known address was in Queens, New York, but her family hadn't heard from her in quite some time, so making any determinations about what she had done in the days leading up to her death was difficult to do. In fact, the medical examiner initially ruled her death a drug overdose, which would be disproven years later. A third victim was found on September 23rd, when the remains of 31-year-old Yoon Lee were discovered in a steamer trunk floating down the Harlem River, with a fourth victim whose body was too badly degraded for identification found just over a week later. Yoon Lee had a long rap sheet that included drug use and prostitution. The killer's trend of targeting downtrodden women with drug addictions who were likely sex workers was now firmly established, and unfortunately this made the investigation all the more difficult. In fact, at this point, police weren't even sure these murders were related, due to how common it was for sex workers to become victims of violence. And with no suspects in any of the cases, the killer's rampage would continue. In May of 1992, a motorist stopped along I-84 to relieve himself and found the partially clothed body of a young woman lying on the side of the road. The victim was identified as 33-year-old Anna Lopez, who was a mother to 3 young children and, like the prior victims, a known prostitute with a history of drug addiction. 2 months later, on July 9, 1992, a woman called 911 saying an oil drum containing body parts had washed up along the shore next to Coney Island Creek. Police arrived and discovered the remains of 39-year-old Mary Ann Holloman, who they later identified from dental records. Just 2 days later, another oil drum was found by fishermen in the same creek. However, this time the remains were so badly decomposed, police were unable to identify the victim, and it would be another year before police were able to find out who she was. Unfortunately, they just didn't have any leads in either of these cases, and with a staggering 2,000 homicides a year, the department was completely overwhelmed, making the unfortunately low-priority murders of these women even lower, and allowing the Ripper to continue his horrific spree. In November of 1992, the body of 23-year-old Jenny Soto was found along the Harlem River in the South Bronx. Again, like the prior victims, Miss Soto was believed to be involved in prostitution, but unlike most of the prior victims, she had maintained a relatively close relationship with her family, which gave police a much clearer picture of her whereabouts right before the murder. They were able to give investigators the name of a boyfriend Jenny was seeing at the time of her murder, but he was ruled out as a suspect after interviewing with police, leaving investigators back at square one. Ironically, it would not be a breakthrough of evidence or a shrewd deduction from police that would end the killer's spree, but good old-fashioned dumb luck. On the night of June 24, 1993, a sex worker by the name of Tiffany Bracciani was looking for clients on Allen Street in Manhattan. She was accompanied by her 28-year-old boyfriend, Dave Rubenstein, a punk rock singer who was the former frontman of the band Reagan Youth. John approached the couple driving a 1984 Mazda pickup truck. Inside was a nerdy-looking man wearing a thick pair of glasses, 34-year-old Joel Rifkin. Rifkin was known to many of the prostitutes around New York City, as he solicited one for their services on an almost nightly basis. Tiffany had never met Mr. Rifkin, but assumed the soft-spoken man to be harmless like most of her clientele were. She told Dave that she would be back in a few minutes, climbed into Joel's truck, and drove off with him. It was the last time she was ever seen alive again. An hour later, when Tiffany had failed to return, Mr. Rubenstein placed a phone call to 911 and gave police a description of the vehicle she had left in. Police scoured the area, but no signs of the Mazda pickup truck were found. 2 weeks later, a state trooper spotted a pickup truck driving with a missing license plate near Melville's Republic Airport. He attempted to pull the truck over due to the missing plate, but the driver fled, resulting in a chase. Troopers chased the truck all the way to Manola, where it ironically crashed into a telephone pole directly in front of a courthouse. The driver of the vehicle was Joel Rifkin. Police detained him and were a bit shocked that he had gone through such lengths to avoid what would have been a minor traffic ticket. However, as they searched his vehicle and noticed a foul-smelling odor coming from the bed of the truck, his reasons for running soon became apparent. Police found the partially nude and badly decomposed body of Tiffany Bracciani. She had been dead for at least a week. The following morning, police asked him to explain why there was a body in the bed of his truck, and he was surprisingly forthcoming, saying that it was a prostitute he'd picked up on Allen Street, they had had sex, and things went bad. The callous nature with which Rifkin described what happened led police to conclude this was likely not his first victim, and as they interviewed him over the course of the next 8 hours, they soon discovered the horrific depths to the crimes of Joel Rifkin. Rifkin confessed to the murders of all the women we've discussed in the video so far, but that wasn't everything. In a stunning revelation, he also claimed to have murdered 8 other women over the past 5 years. Police were initially skeptical of some of these confessions. Rifkin had an admittedly spotty memory and only knew many of his victims by their street names. But as officers combed through reports of missing persons and Jane Does, they soon came to realize he was telling the truth. He ID'd multiple Jane Does whose remains had been found over the years. This included 22-year-old Mary DeLuca, whose body was found shortly after Yoon Lee, 28-year-old Lorraine Orvieto, who had been found in Coney Island Creek just 2 days after Mary Holloman, 21-year-old Violet O'Neill, who had been found near Governor's Island in July of 1992, and 31-year-old Mary Williams, who had been found in Yorktown in December of 1992. Rifkin also informed police of burial sites which had not been discovered. This led police to the body of 25-year-old Iris Sanchez near JFK Airport and 30-year-old Lauren Marquez, whose remains were found in the Pine Barrens of Suffolk County. Finally, there were 3 other victims Rifkin claimed to have murdered, whose remains he said would never be found. The only one of the 3 he could recall was a woman named Julie Blackbird, who had actually been Rifkin's second victim, having been murdered in late 1990. Her body was never recovered, and the only evidence of her fate was Rifkin's confession, and her handwritten diary, which was found during a search of his home. In addition to her diary, police found dozens of trinkets such as jewelry, ID cards, purses, and medicine bottles that Mr. Rifkin kept as trophies of his crime. When all was said and done, the list of confirmed murders stood at 15 women, with 2 others Rifkin claimed to have killed, but no evidence ever found as to who they were. The monstrous spree of the man dubbed Joel the Ripper by the New York media was grisly and horrific, with the only question in investigators' minds now being why. Joel Rifkin was born on January 20th, 1959. 3 weeks later, he was adopted by Bernard and Jean Rifkin, who would go on to adopt a daughter as well 3 years later. As a student, Rifkin did not perform well. Despite being highly intelligent with an IQ of 128, he floundered in his classes and would often barely pass, much to the disappointment of his demanding father. It was later theorized that he suffered from dyslexia, though he was never officially diagnosed. Worse than his grades, though, was the torment he would often face at the hands of his fellow students. Rifkin was a prime target for bullies all throughout his school years. He would often suffer beatings, public humiliation, and having his belongings stolen or intentionally destroyed. Rifkin's bullies were often quite relentless, finding him even after school hours and continuing to torment the socially awkward boy. As you may have guessed, Rifkin did not have great success with girls growing up. Throughout his years in grade school, there were no records of him ever having a girlfriend, and he was often barely able to even look a woman in the eye. In 1972, he first watched the Alfred Hitchcock film Frenzy, and found himself becoming aroused at the scenes featuring young women being strangled to death by the film's antagonists. This particular film would become a focal point for the dark fantasies Rifkin would act on later. During his teen years, he gained an obsession for prostitutes and would often take his parents' car out late at night and drive around Long Island looking for ones to hire. This habit turned into a full-on addiction, and Rifkin would soon start spending hundreds of dollars a week hiring sex workers. After graduating high school, he attempted to go to a local community college to study photography, but his now daily habit of hiring prostitutes quickly drained what little money he had and made him unable to focus on his studies. In 1978, he took a job at a local music store and later that year again tried enrolling in community college. This time he actually maintained admirable grades and even briefly dated one of his classmates. However, that relationship soon ended, and Rifkin was once again back to hiring prostitutes at an almost nightly rate. In 1984, he gave up on his college aspirations for good and moved back in with his parents. Rifkin held down odd jobs throughout the rest of the 1980s, but secretly was starting to have trouble containing the dark fantasies within himself. He would collect newspaper scraps featuring stories of murdered women and create a collage of them. He also found himself becoming more and more obsessed with serial killers like Ted Bundy, and would often spend the nights he wasn't out looking for prostitutes watching the strangulation scenes from Frenzy over and over again. After his father passed away in 1987, Rifkin started to reflect on his life and viewed it as an abject failure, something he blamed on his obsession with prostitutes. He came to the conclusion that the only way he could rid himself of his addiction was to finally act on his fantasy of strangling a woman to death. On the night of March 4th, 1989, he picked up the woman known to him only as Susie, and drove her around to buy drugs before returning to his home in Long Island, intending to have sex with her, but was unable to perform. Susie again asked him to buy her drugs, which according to Rifkin made him fly into a rage. He grabbed a souvenir howitzer shell and beat the young woman across her head. Miraculously though, she survived and began fighting back right after he put the shell down, biting and scratching Rifkin repeatedly, until he eventually strangled her to death. The following morning, he dismembered her body and placed her head in a paint can, which he took to the Hopewell golf course, where it was found later that afternoon. Though he had finally acted on his fantasy, Rifkin found that instead of bringing him relief, it only drove him to want to kill again. He restrained himself for 2 years, but in 1990 he would begin again with the murder of Julie Blackbird, and continue until 1993 when he was finally caught. In July of 1993, he was arraigned on charges of murder in the case of Tiffany Bresciani. Initially, Rifkin and his lawyer tried having the confessions thrown out, arguing that police had denied his request to speak with a lawyer multiple times throughout the interrogation and that he'd given his confession under duress. The judge rejected this motion, and then the defense strategy pivoted to arguing Rifkin was innocent by reason of insanity. He claimed that his learning disabilities, coupled with his traumatic childhood experiences, had left him unable to distinguish right from wrong, and that he wasn't mentally fit to stand trial. Rifkin's lawyer knew full well this was unlikely to work, and tried to get all of the charges rolled into one trial, which would take place in Rifkin's hometown of Nassau County. The logic being a hometown jury would likely be more open to granting their insanity plea. However, before they could even get this plan in motion, Rifkin inexplicably fired his lawyer and hired two new ones. Former Nassau County Assistant DA Michael Soshnick and his partner, who literally had no experience with criminal trials, John Lawrence. In November 1993, this new team sought to have Rifkin's confession suppressed, and even tried arguing that the police didn't have probable cause to search his vehicle, which, well, points for creativity, I guess. After months of back-and-forth legal procedure, the judge rejected all of the defense motions, and in response, Mr. Rifkin immediately fired Michael Soshnick, leaving him with just John Lawrence, who, again, had no experience with criminal trials, as his only lawyer heading into his criminal trial in 1994. This did not go well for him, and Rifkin was found guilty on 9 counts of second-degree murder. During sentencing, the presiding judge made his feelings on Joel Rifkin quite clear and handed down a sentence of 203 years. He will be eligible for parole in 2197 when he is 238 years old. His one and only appeal was rejected by the New York Supreme Court in 2002, and he hasn't filed any more in the years since. In 2013, Susie, Rifkin's first victim, was finally identified through the use of DNA as 25-year-old Heidi Balch. Sadly, 2 of his victims still remain nameless and are only known as number 6 and number 9. I think if there's anything we can learn from this story, it's that the lives of the downtrodden in stories like these are often all too easy to ignore. No one is perfect, and while these women may have found themselves on a rough path in life, their lives still matter just as much as anyone else's, and they deserve to be remembered. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.